Bass. Bass. Not the kind in your cannon-shaped speaker subwoofer that you hide in your trunk so you can impress girls at stoplights.
And not Richard Pryor bass.
And not Richard Pryor bass. I think that's a cocaine reference. Completely appropriate.
It's not free.
It's not free.
Free bass.
But the kind of bass that allows you to build a structure. Something that serves as a foundation. So that can be physical, that can be intellectual. And in jiu-jitsu, if you're serious about your training, it should be both. You should have well-informed concepts that are practical and applicable. And the best way to develop a well-informed concept is to get it from an expert. And what is an expert? It's someone who spent time engaging with material, tested the material, put it through a rigorous scientific process, tried to do everything that they can do to disprove it, and then having failed to disprove the theory, allowed it to emerge as something reasonably and consistently successful. So bass is the epitome of the successful, rigorous testing, the successful attempt to consistently make jiu-jitsu principles falsifiable. It all rests in bass. Bass means that I have a platform from which stability matriculates its way into all of my practice. Now, the most typical example of bass that you get in early jiu-jitsu is learning how to stand up in bass. Typically, what you'll do is start in this seated position, and both hands will be on either side of your hips. And then you'll lean to the side of your choice. Like I like to lean a little right. One foot will plant on the mat, and the other leg will remain bent, and this arm rests across your knee. There's a lot of reasons for all of these shapes that I'm currently making with my body. For example, the arm can become a defense against a punch or a kick from a standing opponent. The leg can elevate and kick straight to the knee or to the chin of a standing attacker. But all of that depends on your ability to remain rooted to the mat. So I'm rooted to the mat mostly on my right side because that's where my weight has tilted. And that means that I'm splitting my weight between my right hip and my right hand. The bent leg here is still touching, and the foot is still touching. And now I'm going to start building this tripod. All of the weight should now transfer to my right hand. And I have to make friends with the mat and ground myself in the mat, be friendly with the earth, ground myself in the earth. And putting the weight on the hand, I should float my hips. And now you should be able to swing a little bit. And when you swing, you have to let your body just relax and open itself. The goal is to take the bent knee and put it behind the elbow of the based hand. We used to teach this back in the day by saying, put the foot behind the hand. And then sometimes what would happen is people would put their weight on their hand. They would stand up and they'd put the foot behind the hand, but they leave their knee bent like this. It's a very compromised base. You see, they fall now back to a reduced position. So then Rorion Gracie, easily one of the best teachers of jiu-jitsu on the planet. His level of pedagogy is outstanding. If you ever get a chance to watch Rorion teach, there's multiple videos on YouTube, and there's also an original series of Gracie instructionals that came out just around the time that Royce had won the first UFC. They're on VHS, but you can find them now digitally on YouTube. Rorion teaches, watch the way Rorion teaches. He teaches by having a conversation with jiu-jitsu, with you about jiu-jitsu. And then in real time, he allows the knowledge to expand. It's a really fascinating way to think about this because jiu-jitsu is in fact a language. And when you're learning techniques, you're learning the vocabulary. But when you're learning the principles and the concepts, which is what we're concentrating on in all these video series, you are learning the grammar and the syntax. And you can have a list of vocabulary words. And even if you have them memorized, that's fine, but that doesn't mean you can speak the language. Only when you weave those words together in simple and then increasingly complex sentence structures and form paragraphs and actually connect them with themes and meanings can you actually speak the language of jiu-jitsu. So this is why it's important to go beyond just mere technique. You have to have concepts and principles that become your grammar and syntax for your language of jiu-jitsu. Right now, the planted hand is allowing me to lift my hips. Now, as I lift my hips and I place my knee behind my elbow, my foot, which is below my knee, naturally falls into the base position. So instead of worrying about the foot behind the hand, which I can get, but then my knee might become compromised, causing me to fall, or to reduce the base position, to compromise the base position, shoot for the knee behind the elbow. Once the knee is behind the elbow, the foot naturally finds its place on the ground. Now I have a tripod built. One hand in front, two based feet behind, and from here I go hand to knee, and then I can start to stand up. All the while, don't forget that the purpose of the original hand across the knee is to serve as a defensive mechanism for blocking any strikes coming from an advancing attacker. So then you say, okay, well, what if the person doesn't punch or kick, but now Pal's going to run at me and he's going to push me over? So I'm able to sit up right now on my hand, but then when Pal comes running at me, he pushes me onto my back. Hang on, we're having a technical issue. Okay, here comes Pal. And instead of he pushes me to my back. Now where's my base, right? My base still has to be the mat. Or rather, I'm sorry, my base still has to be the relationship with the mat. So my base went from one hand and one hip and one foot to now both hips and both hands. You see, and now as Pal's approaching me to attack, if he gets within range of my feet, I can kick him away. If he bends over, I can kick the face. Let me turn a little sideways here. If he comes too close, I can kick him away. If he bends over, I can kick the face. Notice how I reset the base by helping with the planted foot. And then if I gain the distance I need, look how easy it is to now rock up to the seated position, and using the hand as a gauge or a measuring stick, I can increase the distance. And then here's the original position I was in. My hip is elevated off the mat, and the goal is to put the knee behind the elbow. And now I'm in base, and I'm still protected, and I can shuffle back into a range which allows me to either turn tail and run or engage from the feet. So that's the concept of base, and that's the concept of building base. The important thing to understand about the concept of base in jiu-jitsu is that where and when it shows up will actually determine your ability to successfully respond to an attack. Katie Chong is here. Kim Tran Dyer is here, the famous architect. Great. So here's an example of base in action from the feet, right? Pal's an attacker. And Pal puts me in a headlock, right? From the side, yeah, from the side. Now, look what happens here. Initially, I'm standing up tall. And when I'm standing up tall, my shoulders and hips are in the same line. The degree to which he puts my shoulders in front of my hips is the degree to which my face heads towards the ground, and boom, I face plant. I don't want that to happen. Just as little as I want the idea of my hips going behind my shoulders to happen, and I end up falling on my back and cracking the back of my head on the concrete. So here, the headlock defense has a series of techniques connected to it, but the purpose of those techniques is to actually root themselves in base and then grow out of the base in a way that they matriculate through successful defense and eventual escape. The number one thing to do is consider that as the headlock is being applied, my shoulders are being pushed in front of my hips, which compromises my base, because now I have to add back that tripod hand, but I can't without the risk of getting punched, you see? So before we even get there, The very first thing I have to do as soon as someone touches my head is to widen the feet, soften the knees, make sure the hips are squared with the shoulders, and then look, I'm going to roll the pelvis forward. It's a little bit perverse. It's a provocative movement, but it's a pelvic tilt. This is the pelvic tilt. You see, when the muscles behind here, the glutes are relaxed, then the pelvis rolls backwards, and that starts to curve the spine and make the shoulders vulnerable to a forward tilt. If I want to build that base back up, I have to squeeze the glutes, roll the pelvis forward, and then straighten the spine. Now look, as soon as he touches me, if I don't make that base, if I say soften the hips and too soft in the knees and I allow him to pull me down, now he can punch me or he can join hands and wrestle me to the ground all the way. Right? And I end up in this bad, now I'm really eating the punches. So how do I stop this? The very first thing I do is I shoot my hands in front and back. I'm sorry, that's not the first thing I do. That's the second thing I do. The very first thing I do is I build the base by widening my feet, softening my knees, and tilting my pelvis forward. Now, as he tries to pull me down, I've built a base that makes my shoulders untippable because I'm thrusting my hips forward. He may now really try. Pal's very strong. All right, here's how I can help myself if I start to tip under the guy's strength. I can now add a frame. The frame is my hand closest to his body, touching his neck, and then I back that up with a grip on my wrist. This right angle here that I've built with my top arm is very powerful. And as I control his head, which is what leads the direction of his body, and which helps him stay on his base, I compromise his base by creating distance between us. Not with a push, but just with an insertion. This is a wedge to keep him from getting close. And as long as my pelvis stays rolled forward and I keep the wedge in place, it's very hard. You can really try it. Right? It's very hard for him to do this. Okay, now, let's say that he does successfully break me down because I miss all of that. Now the punches are going to start because he's put my face in range. So keeping the base that I have, both of my hands should shoot across the front. As he punches, I'm just trying to contain the arm. You see, I'm not going to stop the punch. This is not some kind of fancy karate block. It's just another obstacle so that I say, if you want to punch me in the face, you first have to get past my arm. So he may try to swim past my arm. And it's easy just to stay sticky because the arm here in front tends to be longer than his ability to retract, which is necessary for the punch. So guess what it makes him do? It makes him retract even more, and now look what happens. Right, when he pulls back along his own rib cage to wind up for the punch, now I can capture the arm. And as he comes forward, because the arm is waiting, I can hold the wrist. And now the second hand can join that hand and pin the arm. And guess what? Now he only has the power of one arm to pull the headlock with. What made the headlock powerful initially? Well, two things. One, his own power, and two, I messed up and didn't insert the appropriate base. So the very first thing to do when someone touches your head is drop in the base, roll the hips forward, make the frame. Now they're going to join their hands to build strength. And as they do, we're going to try, but sometimes the frame fails and I get dipped, and then the punches start. So now I put this in front just to block. And the block is annoying, so it makes him reach back farther, which means I can now hook over, and as he comes through, I can catch and then pin the arm. This hand initially began as over, and then it swims underneath to go connect to the forearm and pin to his own body. Now he only has the power of one hand on the headlock, right? This is a great place to be for me. And here's where I can buy myself a few seconds to widen my base, soften my knees, tilt my hips forward, and start to straighten my spine. By the way, straightening your spine does not mean pulling your head out. If it's Pal's powerful arm versus my neck, really pull hard, I'm going to get stuck here. That sucks. But watch the difference. If I just try to lift my neck, that's very painful. But if he puts power into his arm, and now I straighten my spine, you see it's different. And when the spine is straight, I can keep his arm with me, and then I step from the base position that I'm in and open a door wide, landing in a second base. And in keeping the arm attached, I can start to shuffle backwards And here's what happens to his arm behind the back. It ends up bent in this compromised position. For those of you who train, you'll recognize that bend in the arm as the same shape the arm makes when you execute a Kimura or when you execute an Americana, right? Or if you're a shoulder locker from bottom guard, the leg Kimura is the omoplata. In any event, whenever you bend someone's arm into this shape, it compromises the shoulder, and when you attach grips to either end of the arm and then activate them with torque, you can break the shoulder. In the same way, that 90-degree bend in the arm is my saving grace against the headlock attack, as we've just demonstrated. Now, what if this progresses even further and the headlock ends up on the ground? So here we are on the ground, and Pal has headlocked me. Let me do the rocking chair to get close. Okay. He's headlocked me. I just do the same thing as if I'm standing up. After all, the ways in which our bodies are operating here on the ground is equivalent to the way that they would be if we were standing. We've just changed the plane. That's all we've done. We've changed the plane. I can still take my rear arm and make the frame and back up the support of it with my wrist. Now, I'd like to create a little angle here. So one trick is to use the base of my foot to bridge over the shoulder, walk the foot away a little bit, and then fill that gap with my hips. Now I'm on my side. And what this does is it makes the top arm a little longer and the bottom arm a little more compact. I want the top arm longer because my goal is maybe to eventually reach over his shoulder to help contain the arm against the punch the way I initially did. I want the bottom arm here a little more compact because the goal is going to be to wedge it against his hips to keep him from advancing, right? In either event here, because I've got a solid base with my foot and a solid base on my hip, and even here a solid base on my elbow, I can remain safe against the attack. Now, if Pal steps away for a second, I want you to look at the relationship between these things. My foot, which is one component of my base, my hip, which is one component of my base, and my elbow, which is one component of my base. This is the exact same three ingredients that make up the seated base that we initially talked about. Look, here's the foot, here's the hip, here's the elbow. But if I were to sit up, here's the foot, here's the hip, and the elbow just becomes the hand, and we're back where we were. You see? Same bend, same frame. This time that frame is being used to block against strikes. If we end up on the ground, now that frame is a wedge. The same way it is when I get attacked with a headlock from the standing position. This elbow goes to the ground when I'm on the ground because I want to wedge his hips the same way I wedge his neck. So two frames operate here, and what we're doing is statistically outmaneuvering him. I'm going 2-on-1. Two wedges as opposed to his one line of attack. So now with me facing the camera this way, you can see when Pal approaches me from the side here and headlocks me from the ground position, all of the ingredients remain the same. I've got a frame in the back that's bent at a 90-degree angle. I've got a frame in the front that's bent at a 90-degree angle, and those two work cooperatively together to control his head and his hips. I've got a rear foot, which creates a base. I've got a hip planted on the ground, which creates a base. And now just by bridging into him a little bit, shrimping away, and then holding him still so he can't follow me, after I make this base with the mat, when I lift both legs, I can use my rear leg, the same one that I was basing with initially, over his head to push him away and escape from the headlock. There's a lot of things to say here. One of the biggest mistakes people make is they think this is an arm lock. It's not an arm lock. You're just escaping the headlock. You're using your base to do it. My hip and elbow are still on the ground. I still have a relationship with the mat. And now the same way that I built a base from the seated position to the feet, I'm going to build a base from the laying down position to the seated position. How? When the arm stretches, the elbow pulls itself underneath. And then from the elbow, it's easy to go to the hand. And from the hand, look, I'm going to step off, just like I did initially, and then stand up in base, just like I did from the seated position. But instead of going all the way to the foot, I'm just going to go to the knee. And now I'm going to walk close and cover my opponent in a top-heavy side mount position. Right, so without a partner, this looks like this. I'm stuck on the ground in a headlock position, but if I give up my base, my head gets crushed and pulled close, or I eat punches to the face. So it's very important that you remain grounded. The hip remains grounded, the foot in the rear remains grounded, and my elbow remains grounded. The free hand activates a frame just like it would from the feet, and the second hand, the backup hand, activates a wedge in the hip. So now I've got two frames versus his one arm of attack. Once I bridge into him and open up a little space by taking my hips out, I can reset the foot and even start to walk away a little bit. And then holding him still, don't push him, but hold him still so he can't come close. Your opponent will find that the ridge, bony part of your forearm, stuck in the soft side of his or her neck, is very uncomfortable, and the harder they squeeze, the more difficult it becomes for them to actually successfully execute the headlock. Now that I've created this impasse, when I lift my legs, this leg here, the rear leg, goes over the head and stretches the person away. And now I just have to rebuild my base. So I'm going to start from the hand, because I've already got the elbow and hip on the ground. I've given up a little bit with the foot here, but that's okay because I'm stuck to him. When I stretch the arm, the elbow pulls itself to a more elevated position. Watch how we go from straight right back to 90 degrees. Same concept. Now we go from 90 degrees, elbow to hand. And you see what I've effectively done is rocked myself back to the seated position that we began this discussion in. So from that position now, the only difference is I've got this guy stuck, got his neck stuck between my legs. And again, there's chokes and things you could do from here, but we're just talking about defending the headlock by keeping and then reestablishing any lost base and making that our primary structure. Once I get back to this position, I can step off, and then the knee goes behind the elbow again. The only difference is I'm not going to stand up fully like I did initially, which was the example of standing up in base. I'm going to simply go to the knee and stay close to him so I can keep my weight on the opponent and keep him from getting away. So the knee just goes behind the elbow like this. There are some people who call this position combat base. I was never taught that term. We never called it that. It's just a kneeling base, but if that is the terminology you're accustomed to, then fine, this is a combat base. One kind of interesting tidbit is that when you consider the lineage of jiu-jitsu in Brazil having come directly from Japan, which means that jiu-jitsu really is exclusively Japanese, at least in its first iteration in South America. And then before that, it actually comes from India. And we can get into the Sanskrit and who, what, where, why, when, and how of that in the questions. But you'll notice this position is like the sword drawing position, right? Samurai art of jiu-jitsu, weaponless defense, got to get back to your sword, which is your soul. And this position, the combat base, is the position from which they would draw or reset the sword. So there's some interesting historical adaptation there. In any event, all of these positions from the feet or from the knees can be reversed. So in this position, if Kyle were still laying next to me here, and his feet would be pointed this way because we just escaped from the head. We'll just do the whole thing, right? I'm wedging, I bridge, I make the base, I walk away, the leg pushes him off, and now I build my base back up, right? Keeping this connected so he can't pull away or roll away. Right? If I let it go, maybe he can roll away. Okay, but I keep this to make it hard for him to roll away. Now I build the base from the elbow to the hand, and then I step off the head and put the knee behind the elbow, and then drive my chest forward. And if you just put this leg down 1 sec, I drive my chest forward. This hand that's hooking his arm goes under his head, and now I contain him in a top-heavy side mount position, right? If you'd like to get really old school and think about this from the World War II judo, World War II era jiu-jitsu science, that is the first stuff that Elio learned from his brother, who got it from some of the Kodokan fellows. The immediate transition does go to a straight arm lock, right? So here Pal is locking the head and I'm framing the neck, but it's all about the base. I'm based on the foot, based on the hip, based on the elbow. I bridge, I shrimp, I walk away. When I walk away, he dips. Notice that concept that we talked about earlier. Right now, his shoulders are in front of his hips, but because he's on the ground, it's actually making him very powerful. On the ground, when his shoulders go behind his hips, look what happens. He falls over. What's holding him up? His connection to my head. That's all. It's the same thing that happened earlier when I was first sitting up in this ready position, and then Pal pushed me over, and my shoulders went behind my hips, and I had to fall to the ground and start activating the kicks before I could build myself back up and elevate through base, right? Now I'm just doing that to him. I'm putting him in that compromised position. The shoulders go behind the hips, not because I push him there, but because I hold him still, open a space, and then help him into that space with my head. With my leg. And I stretch the leg. Now I build the base again. 1, 2. Now from this position, sometimes instead of going under the head, I can put my knee behind my elbow, like I would if I would build any base. There's the knee behind the elbow. And now I can put the knee next to the arm and pinching tightly, sit back. And then finish, right? Finish in a straight arm lock position. So that's an option, because I know nobody's happy unless they get a submission out of it at least once, right? Questions? Building base is everything. Without base, nothing else you do works. Any attack that you're initiating, if you're a competitive fighter and you're submission-centric, gi, no gi, whatever it is, if you don't have a base pre-established, you won't have anything to operate from, right? Pal spent many years in the military, and one of the things that he did when he was working, wherever he was working, was centralized himself at a base under a command structure. So a base is a place from which we are stable, and then because we have a stable and secure base, we can begin branching out into other areas of opportunity. Sometimes those areas of opportunity are reversals, which gain you a certain number of points. Sometimes those areas of opportunity are advanced positions that are top dominant, which gain you strategic advantage. Sometimes those areas of opportunity are submissions, which are the kill shot and end the fight. But in any event, without the base, you can't do them at all. So here's a real quick review. This is called the ready position. When I want to establish base from the ground to the feet, I put all of my weight on my hand, elevate my hips, the knee goes behind the elbow. Now I have a tripod, and then I can start to push my hips forward and straighten my spine. If I'm attacked in a headlock from the feet, rather than letting that base crumble back down so I end up on the ground, or even the person holding me tightly and throwing me this way, right? Now, I just do this. I push the hips forward and straighten the spine, and I put a frame to help me. So here comes the headlock, and I don't give up the base. I keep the base built. If they defeat that and tip me anyway, now I worry about punches, so I contain the arm. And I contain the arm until I can build my base back up and lengthen my spine. Don't try to lift your head. You'll hurt your neck. You're gonna lose a battle between the powerful guy's arm and your neck. The neck is a soft spot. Your spine is there. You don't wanna mess with that, right? You wanna straighten your whole spine. How do you do that? By rolling the hips and then standing tall. From this position, I can keep him adhered to me, and I go from a double base position that's close to a double base position that's open, and then I duck out through the open space, and I keep his arm with me until it ends up in this 90-degree bend, which we said is great if we're making a frame, but bad for the guy who's getting his shoulder attacked. You see, that's a chicken wing, or people would call it a Kimura, or people would call it an Americana if it's in this position close to the head. If we're on the ground, I build my base by first saving myself with wedged frames, bridging, shrimping, activating a base so that both legs can safely lift and push him away. Now I build my base again from the top down. Hands straight to 90-degree bend in the elbow to hand plant. And if I'd like to escape entirely, I put my knee behind my elbow and I can get up and run away, or I can step off with the top leg and be heavy. Or if you just have to absolutely do a submission, once the knee's behind the elbow, I put the knee next to the arm and contain the arm, and then keeping the arm pinned to my chest, I sit back to break the arm. In any event, none of this happens if I'm flipping and flopping around. Losing base looks like this. When my shoulders go too far in front of my hips, I face plant. By the way, that's why we forward roll. Losing my base looks like this. If my shoulders go too far behind my hips, I crack my head open on the sidewalk. By the way, that's why we backward roll. Okay? Use your base, it's your friend. Think about what this would mean if you're reverse engineering an attack. If you take away your opponent's base, there's no attack, there's no sweep, there's no submission. And if you preserve yours, you can do anything you want. We're done. It's 12:45. Anyone want to say anything? Nope? Cool. Questions in the comments section if you have them. Thank you guys so much for checking in. We love you. Stay tuned to the compound, as always, for exciting forthcoming announcements about how we'll be adding online classes, instructional series. We're even going to start doing some outdoor training. We're going to shoot a woods backdrop so you guys can have some appreciation for the nature that we're surrounded by. And sooner than later, we're all going to be back together again in person. Love you all.